good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to the Alexandria Center for Hellenistic Studies and Institute for Mediterranean Studies Neoplatonic lectures. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, my colleague and friend, Georgia Tsouni, who will talk on reconsidering the prehistory of Neoplatonism. Georgia is assistant professor of classics at the University of Crete. But before coming to Crete, she has conducted research and or taught at the universities of Basel and Bern in Switzerland, but also at the Center for Hellenic Studies of the University of Harvard University, and among others at the Central European University. Her research focuses on Cicero, but also more generally on Hellenistic and Roman philosophy, with a special focus on the Aristotelian and the Stoic traditions. She is the author of a monograph, Antiochos and Peripatetic Ethics, by Cambridge University Press in 2019, and of many articles on the history of the academy, on Aristotelian ethics and politics, and on Hellenistic philosophy. She has also edited and translated into English Arios Didymos Epitome of Peripatetic Ethics, which is preserved by Stoveos, and this is in the volume Arios Didymos on Peripatetic Ethics, Household Management and Politics by Routledge in 2017. Last time, Professor d'Ancona took us from late antique Athens and Alexandria to 10th century Haran and Baghdad. And today, Georgia is taking us back to where everything began, to the old bridge, in a way, between Athens and Alexandria, in order to reconsider the way in which Athens and Alexandria mark a new beginning in the history of Platonism at the turn of the first century, thus paving the way for Plotinus and his successors. Georgia, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ.
Thank you very much, Irene. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, very nice, because I think I have some problems with the sound, but I hope everything will be fine. Also, would it be possible for you to share
yes, there is a handout, which I will share via the chat.
Okay. Also, I'm not sure if I will be able to share the screen. So if something is happening with the settings, so if you can just share,
yes, I will share
to share. Okay, very nice. Okay, so thank you very much, Irene, for your kind words and for inviting me to this lecture series, which has hosted very distinguished scholars of Platonism. As you said, today we will make some sort of reverse move in relation to the last talk by Professor d'Ancona, since I intend to focus on philosophical developments from Athens to Alexandria, which, however, take place some centuries before the scope of Irene's project, namely in the 1st century BC and the turn of the early 1st century AD. So what I plan to talk about touches upon the beginnings of what we call dogmatic Platonism in the late Hellenistic and early imperial period. This period testifies to some of the earliest readings of Plato along dogmatic lines, which will be the focus of my attention. I will not discuss how these developments relate to later Neoplatonic readings of Plato, which fall within the project. But this may be something that will come up in the discussion, and other participants here will certainly be more competent than I am to comment on them. There are two figures who are usually connected to the emergence of Platonic dogmatism and to the movement which is usually called Middle Platonism in scholarship, respectively. The one is Antiochus of Ascalon, who was a member of the Platonic Academy in Athens before and after its closure, following the events of the Roman conquest of Athens by Sylla, and whose ideas are witnessed primarily through Cicero's dialogues. The second figure is Eudorus from Alexandria, who is explicitly mentioned in the Stobaeus, in the first part of the ethical, doxographical, the three doxographies, in the second book of Stobaeus' Selections, as the writer of an extensive book on the major topics of all three philosophical disciplines. Eudorus was explicitly one of the sources of Didymus, who is again identified with a Stoic philosopher, court philosopher of Augustus, Arius Didymus. And it may well be the case, although it is not entirely uncontroversial, that the views that Didymus cites in Stobaeus on the Platonic telos may well reflect Eudorus' views. At least this is what John Dillon also has endorsed in his classical study on Middle Platonism. Now, the two protagonists that I have presented sometimes are studied in isolation, and it remains somewhat still controversial whether Antiochus should be counted among the first Middle Platonists. This is reflected in John Dillon's seminary study on Middle Platonism, where Antiochus' relation to the movement of Middle Platonism is regarded as somewhat insecure. And also, perhaps more radically, in the recent and very valuable collection of Middle Platonists by George Boy Stones, which does not include any fragments of Antiochus in the collection. Furthermore, there has been a powerful trend in scholarship to present Antiochus and Eudorus as defending two different conceptions on the telos, on the goal of human life. The former is associated with the view that the telos is a life according to nature, kataphysin chen, or secundum naturam viver, a formula associated primarily with the Stoics, whereas the latter explicitly, according to the evidence we find in Stobaeus, advocated the idea of assimilation to the divine, the homoiousis theon, as the proper goal of human life. Given the importance assigned to this idea by subsequent Platonists, some scholars have taken these different formulations as evidence of a new orientation, which marks the starting point of Middle Platonism against a late Hellenistic Stoicizing phase represented by Antiochus. Against this background, I believe that perhaps reconsidering the respective views of Antiochus and Eudorus on the reconstruction of Plato's doctrines, specifically in the case of ethics, can be instructive and can help us appreciate better whether there was a new beginning of Platonism in Alexandria in the late 1st century BC. I think there was a new beginning, but to what extent this was a radical new beginning is the question. And what were the new characteristics of this phase of Platonism in relation to its preceding form, which is represented by Antiochus? So after these preliminary remarks, I will start first with Antiochus. In Cicero's philosophical works, we find evidence of a dogmatic reading of Plato, which goes back to the figure of Antiochus of Ascalon. Although a pupil of Philo of Larissa, the last scholar of the skeptical phase of the academy, although of course there were different variations of skepticism, Antiochus decided at some point to depart intellectually from the Academy of Philo. This is the famous, notorious secession of Antiochus, in order to revive the old academy, from which allegedly the successors of Plato, from Arcesilaus down to Philo, had departed. In this framework, Antiochus also defended the view that Plato held dogmata, that means crystallized views about all major philosophical topics, views which represent the truth. Antiochus's belief in the latter was linked to his endorsement of Stoic epistemology, and specifically the possibility of apprehensive knowledge, or catalepsis, against the possibility of which both Arcesilaus and Carneades had vehemently reacted. The rift between the two academies, we have the characterizations, of course, the old academy, new academy, was reflected in the way Platonic dialogues were read. So in the new academy, the focus lays on the Socratic aspects of Plato's teaching, and the dialogue form of his works was interpreted as a guide for skeptical epistemology. So indicative of this reading are the comments of the character Cicero in the first text on your handout from the academic books of Cicero, the second edition, the second version of the academic books. So there we read, so they call this the new academy. I hope, Irini, you have shared it, the screen.
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry. I have a problem with I cannot see it, but it's fine. As long as you see it, it's okay. They call this the new academy, though I think it is old, assuming we count Plato as part of the old academy. In his books, nothing is affirmed. There are many arguments on either side. Everything is under investigation, and nothing is claimed to be certain. Aside from the epistemological foundations of Platonic dogmatism, the doctrinal reading of Plato was linked to other presuppositions as well. Primary among them was the idea that Plato held consistent views about philosophical issues, and that his work is in that sense unitary. So what emerges with him is the concept of a philosophical system for which the Stoic school could provide perhaps the best model. Such a presupposition was confronted, of course, with a major hermeneutical problem. How is the dialogue form, or more specifically the Socratic or aporetic aspects of Platonic works, to be integrated in the reconstruction of Platonic dogmata? Antiochus's reading did acknowledge Socratic aporetic practice in the Platonic dialogues, but it seems that he viewed it only as a methodological tool, which was compatible with the reconstruction of Platonic doctrines in all areas. Along these lines, he may have traced in the dialectical aspects of Platonic works a propedeutic function, which was not incompatible with firm commitment to certain ideas, such as the sufficiency of virtue for happiness. A more nuanced reading was applied also to non-aporetic, non-Socratic dialogues, which, aside from a Socratic ethical side, testify to a Pythagorean or physical side of Plato. So this is the second text on the handout. Cicero alludes in his dialogue, the Republica, as part of an exchange between the characters Scipio and Tubero, to the view that Platonic dialogues unite the Socratic elements with Pythagorean theoretical ideas, pointing to works, of course, such as the Timaeus. This is a view, the synthesis between Socrates and Pythagoras is a view, of course, which is going to have a very big tradition in later Platonists. In the same passage, Cicero refers to Plato's travels to Egypt and Sicily, where he associated with Archytas and Timaeus Locrus and learned their teachings, which he integrated into some of his works. Antiochus also claimed that his own reading of Platonic texts, this is a further important presupposition, was in line with the early academic tradition. And that included Speusippus down to Polemo or Crantor. And this old academic tradition represented, according to him, a historical and doctrinal unity down to the time of Archesilaus, when he detected a rift in the history of the academy. This explains the collective reference to academics from Speusippus down to Polemo in Antiochian passages. You have an example, I think, in text 4 on your handout, which purport to represent the philosophical views of the old academy. In a passage from Varros's speech in Cicero's academic books, and Varro represents Antiochus in this dialogue, we find the idea that Plato was the originator of a single school, which includes both academics and peripatetics, coupled with a view that this school conveys a uniform and consistent system, una et consentens philosophiae forma. The remark at the end of the passage that the academic and the peripatetic schools agree in doctrine, whereas they differ only in verba, in terminology, also shows that his reading was willing to set aside terminological differences, which he could detect between the different representatives of the old academy, for the sake of identifying the res, that is the meaning or the concept behind those different formulations. So I just alluded to text 3 on your handout, where we read that originating with Plato, a thinker of manifold variety and fertility, various et multiplex, is Plato characterized here, there was established a philosophy that, though it had two appellations, was really a single and uniform system, a forma, that of the academic and the peripatetic schools, which, while agreeing in doctrine, differed in terminology. The collective references to the academic successors of Plato, down to Archesilaus, of course, are linked to methodological problems with regard to their interpretation. In particular, lacking explicit references to the works of the Hellenistic Academy, and given the very scarce surviving evidence of the original works of the successors of Plato, it is not easy to discern which of the features of the Antiochian presentation of the Academy may be attributed to Antiochus himself or to the academic authorities that he is citing. It is, however, to be securely reckoned with that Antiochus' reconstruction of Plato's views is very much influenced by early academic works, and we're going to see that Polemo, in the case of ethics, plays a very important role for him. Antiochus' return to the pre-skeptical academy, which is viewed as representative of Plato's own views, had important consequences for the notion of Platonic authority as well. Instead of attempting to resurrect an authentic Plato, purified of other subsequent influences, Antiochus claims instead that Plato may be, and indeed should be, read in the light of his successors and of subsequent philosophical developments which are witnessed in them. Co-opting Aristotle, who is viewed as a major authority alongside Plato, especially in the domain of ethics, is justified in this way. Thus, the notion of Platonic authority in play here is inclusive and dynamic. Antiochus goes so far as to include the Stoics in the same lineage, and in fact, his reconstruction of Plato seems to rely heavily on Stoic classifications. Even the tripartition of philosophy into ethics, physics, and dialectic was most probably introduced by the Stoics. And he uses, of course, heavily vocabulary, which is, again, Stoic, like the terms orgiosis or kathekon. Even if in the case of epistemology, Antiochus does seem to adopt Stoic doctrines, like the notion of catalepsis, of apprehensive impression, the inclusion of the Stoics in the other domains, physics and ethics, seems to have primarily a polemical aim. The Stoics vindicated for themselves the academic, or more specifically Socratic legacy, And by showing that, and by Antiochus, by showing that their doctrines are already present in the ancients, already present in the original texts of the Academy, he could show that the Stoic school is derivative and inferior to the ancient tradition that he resurrects. To this end, he could also use strategies already employed by Carneades against the Stoics. Having all these strata in mind, academic, peripatetic, and Stoic, we can approach now the Antiochian reconstruction of old academic ethics as found in Paisius' speech in the last book of Cicero's De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum. Paisius' account of old academic ethics in the last book of Cicero's De Finibus provides our most extensive evidence on the way Antiochus read the ethics of the academic tradition. One should, however, also bear in mind that although the account conveys the ethics of the old academy, it explicitly has a peripatetic character as well. Whereas elsewhere, I have offered an extensive analysis of the peripatetic credentials of this account, here I will attempt to show how the account of Paisius contains Platonic echoes as well, in a way that presents the academy in fundamental unity with the peripatos in the domain of ethics. More specifically, I will discuss the possibility that the first Alcibiades was used by Antiochus as one of his sources in order to reconstruct the Platonic academic ethical account. If this is plausible, it provides us with evidence on the canonical status of the dialogue in this period. The proposal is to a certain extent speculative, of course, since contrary to later Platonists, Antiochus does not use direct quotation from the Platonic dialogues in his discussion. A lack of direct textual allusions to the text is linked to his methodology. Contrary to academics and Platonists of the imperial era, Antiochus is not engaged in textual exegesis. His aim is rather to offer, on the basis of ideas found in the source texts, a doctrinal reconstruction of the Platonic philosophical system. Lacking verbatim quotations also does not allow us to establish securely whether he was directly engaging with the Platonic text or only in a mediated way. The influence of another academic work, such as the treatise of Polemo on ethics, which is vaguely alluded to in some passages of the Finibus, may not be excluded. Also, my claim that there is an influence of the first Alcibiades in the account need not mean that the first Alcibiades was the only text that Antiochus used for his reconstruction of Platonic ethics. The laws, for example, may also have been read as an ethical dialogue by Antiochus, and in fact, a paraphrase from the laws is the only clear allusion to a Platonic dialogue found in Paisius' account, and I think this has some significance. To the first Alcibiades point two main topics in Paisius' speech, namely the connection of the telos with an anthropological account, an account of human nature, as also the importance assigned to self-knowledge as the end point of ethical development. The speech has a starting point which is identified with the chronological first impulse and the starting point of natural appropriation. This is the developmental part, the first part of the account, which is strongly reminiscent of the Stoic ethical account of the Finibus tree, whereas a similar strategy can be found also in the summary of peripatetic ethics, which survives in the second book of Stobaeus' Ecclesiae. After grounding the telos in the first chronological first impulses, the ones that we experience after our birth, Paisius' account proceeds by offering an account of human nature as composite of body and soul, and an ensuing classification of goods, tripartite classification of goods into goods of the body, goods of the soul, and external goods, first on the basis of natural appropriation, and subsequently on the basis of a diairesis, a division of things which are choice-worthy for their own sake, and those which are not choice-worthy for their own sake. The account finishes with remarks on the relative importance of the virtues in relation to other goods. The first part of Paisios' account is, as I said, structured around the concept of natural appropriation, which manifests itself from the beginning of life. Such a natural appropriation suggests that living things have a natural tendency to reach the telos by virtue of impulses towards appropriate things supplied by nature herself. In the case of human beings, natural appropriation is shown in the way small children manifest through their behavior a rudimentary understanding of the virtues, something which is cast in Paisios' account in terms of seeds or sparks of virtue, which seems to be a Platonizing version of the Stoic concept of common or innate concepts. For example, the tendency of children to observe all things around them without being deterred by the threat of punishment is indicative of the human drive towards intellectual virtue. Whereas their behavior during their play with other children or towards their caregivers is indicative of innate tendencies towards social virtues. Subsequently, Paisios' speech offers an account of human nature with a view to establishing the old academic doctrine of the telos, which is cast as a life in accordance with nature, secundum naturam vivere. And this is now text 5 on your handout. So we read there, we must next examine the question of what human nature is, since that is the object of our search. Evidently, human beings consist of mind and body. He used the word animus. But the mind and its components are primary, the parts of the body only secondary. We may also observe that the human body has a configuration superior to that of all other creatures. The human mind, for its part, has a constitution that provides it not only with sense perception, but with the dominant element, intellect, mens, which the whole human person by nature obeys. Intellect encompasses the wondrous powers of reason, understanding, knowledge, and all the virtues. Paisios presents human nature as consisting of both body and rational soul, or mind, animus, whereby he clearly states the superiority of the latter in relation to the former. This superiority is grounded in the idea that human nature obeys the mind, which is the most superior constituent of the soul, and the place where virtue occurs. This, the latter virtue, is defined both as theoretical virtue, scientia, and practical. The superiority of the mind in relation to the body is also advocated with reference to the divinity of the human mind. And this is text 6 on the handout. It follows that the mind's virtue will rank more highly than that of the body, and that the volitional virtues of the mind will come in ahead of the non-volitional. The former are virtues properly so called, and are far superior because they spring from reason, the most divine part of the human being. Qua nihil est in homine divinus. Knowledge of the character and power of the human mind, together with a subordinate body, is further connected by Antiochus to self-knowledge, with an explicit reference to the Pythian maxim, to gnosis auton. So we read in text 7, so we must delve into the workings of nature and reach a deep understanding of what it requires. If not, we cannot know ourselves. This precept seemed too lofty to have a human origin and was therefore assigned to a god. Hence, the Pythian Apollo bids us to know ourselves. But the only way to gain this knowledge is to understand the powers of our body and our mind, and to follow the life that utilizes them to the full. While granting the divine character and superiority of the human nous, Antiochus gives an account of the bodily aspect of human nature as well, as something choice-worthy for its own sake. And I think his line of argumentation there, the one that supports the choice-worthiness the body is very much influenced by Aristotelian ideas in the account. He further goes on to include the bodily goods in his account of the happiest possible life, what he calls vita beatissima, which is achieved if to the possession of virtue we also add the bodily goods, namely health and absence of pain. On the other hand, the external goods are not deemed necessary for the telos, are not properly speaking part of the telos, but only instrumental, as they are not regarded as I said, part of human nature. So this is now text 8 and text 9 on your handout. So in text 8, he says that there are two separate categories of things that are valuable in their own right. They're propter se expedenta. The first is where the ultimate good is realized, namely in the category of mind and body. The second is the class of external goods, namely those that belong neither to mind nor to the body, such as friends, relatives, one's own country. And again, in text 9, he says that he definitely supports the view that the virtues are the constituents of happiness. But on the other hand, he also says that bodily goods do make a contribution to the happiest possible life. So they are an add-on to this happy life, which is guaranteed by the virtues. The remarks from anthropology, as also the reference to self-knowledge and the Pythian maxim, seem to betray an engagement on the part of Antiochus with the first Alcibiades. In the last part of the first Alcibiades, Socrates suggests that in order to cultivate oneself, one needs to know what oneself is, τι ποτεσμέν autoi. The dialogue further testifies to an attempt to define the self in terms of a division of soul and body, whereby the soul is deemed superior to the body as the thing that uses and rules over the body. Further, three options are offered with regard to the question of who one is. The self is identified either only with the body, or only with the soul, or with a combination of the two. Το συναμφότερο, and this is 130A9, the text you have on your handout. On the assumption that the human being is what rules over the body, Socrates suggests that the self, or human being, is to be identified only with the soul. This prefaces an important distinction, which follows at 131A23, namely that knowledge of one's body is knowledge of what is one's own, ta autou, but not of oneself, auton. External goods, such as wealth, are further differentiated both from the self and from what is one's own, namely the body, identified rather as belonging to one's own, ton eautou. This is the translation of Hutchinson that I'm using here. So in the second passage from the first Alcibiades, Socrates asks, if someone takes care of his body, then isn't he caring for something that belongs to him and not for himself? That seems likely. And isn't someone who takes care of his wealth caring neither for himself nor for what belongs to him, but for something even further away? If Antiochus is reading the first Alcibiades, as I have suggested, then it is significant that he does not interpret the dialogue as one excluding the bodily goods from the telos. In fact, although he grants that the soul and specifically the mind is the superior part of human nature, he ultimately sides with the view that we are a synamphoteiron, we are a composite of mind and body. Antiochus' view that on the one hand, virtue is sufficient for the happy life, but at the same time, bodily goods play a role as well, seems to be in line with views of the members of the Old Academy as well, and primarily Polemo, judging from doxographical accounts which survive in Clemens of Alexandria. And this is text 11 on your handout. So there we read that according to Polemo, the telos is defined as a self-sufficiency in all goods, autarkeian, agathon panton, or of the most important ones, ton pleiston kai megiston. At the same time, it is stated that virtue is sufficient for happiness, which comes very close to Antiochus's position that the vita beata is guaranteed by the presence of virtue, while bodily goods can make such a happy life even happier, or indeed happy to the highest extent. For the value of bodily goods as choice-worthy for their own sake, Antiochus could of course quote Aristotle as well, although as Cicero was keen to point, the inclusion of Aristotle could create problems for the thesis of the sufficiency of virtue for happiness, which Antiochus was very keen to defend. If the first Alcibiades lurks in the background there is another feature which is very interesting here. In the first Alcibiades, the part of the soul where knowledge and thinking reside is deemed the more divine part of the soul in 133c, an idea found in Antiochus as well, as we have seen. Socrates makes further in a much discussed passage, 133c, which is text 12 on your handout, further assumptions which liken that part of the soul to God and relate knowledge of oneself to knowledge of everything divine, pantotheon, namely God and wisdom, theon te kai phronesi. Some expressions used by Socrates in the dialogue may suggest that there is something superior to the individual self and intellect, with which self-knowledge may be linked. But the grounds of the identification here in the text of theos and phronesis remain underdetermined. In his account of old academic physics in the second edition of the academic books, the Antiochian Navarro makes reference to a divine intellect, which seems there to be identified with the world soul. And is also a power, a vis, which imposes order on matter. The account alludes to the Timaeus, of which we find at least one explicit allusion in Varus's account. But in its wording, and especially in the identification of the nous with necessity and the fated and immutable sequence of eternal order, it is also reminiscent of Stoic formulations of Hymarmene. This is the text 13. So there, it is said that the old academics say that this power is the world soul. This power is the sort of active power which imposes order or shape to matter. This is a non-personal vis in the case of Antiochus. This power is the world soul, and it is also a mind and perfect wisdom, mentem sapientiamque perfecta, which they call God, and a kind of providence over all the things subject to it, which exercises forethought primarily over celestial affairs, but also over terrestrial matters of relevance to human beings. Sometimes they call this necessity because nothing can be other than as it is determined in the fated and immutable sequence of its eternal order. So this suggests clearly that Antiochus had in mind or could discuss the divine mind as well. He engaged with the idea of the divine mind. However, no references to a divine entity which may function as a paradigm for human life is made in Paisios' ethical account in the Phoenicus. So Antiochus seems to regard the Timaeus as a work belonging exclusively to the domain of physics, but he doesn't make a link between sort of the divinity of the human mind and the divine mind in the Phoenicus. However, evidence for the use of the Timaeus in an ethical context comes in another passage in Sicily, and this is this should be text 14 on your handout. So in a passage from the Tusculan Disputations, 570, we find again reference to the Delphic maxim, know thyself, which is, however, identified there solely with knowledge of the mind. There is also reference to the experience of a connection with the divine mind. Conjunctamque cum divina mentes essentiat. So it says that to the mind occupied night and day in these thoughts, there comes the knowledge enjoined by the god of Delphi that the mind should know its own self and feel its union with the divine mind. And this is a source of a very big joy. Self-knowledge derives here from physical science. And the object of imitation, what one is supposed to imitate, is the eternity of the cosmic chain of causation, expressed again here in terms which point to the Stoic Hemarmena, which is moderated by a divine mind. So it says that thought upon the power and nature of the gods kindles the desire of attaining an immortality that resembles theirs, when it sees that the causes of things are linked one to another in an inevitable chain, and nevertheless their succession from eternity to eternity is governed by reason and intelligence. So what one imitates is this sort of eternal chain of causation, which is manifested in the universe. Suggestive for the cosmic dimension of the passage is the fact that one is not only meant to look upwards, suspiciens, but also around, circumspiciens, as also that the observation of the cosmos yields the knowledge of virtue, right? So it is by observing the part of the cosmos that one acquires virtue. The passage ends with the confirmation of what seems to be the Stoic thesis, that virtue is sufficient for a happy life. And in general, this passage belongs to a dialectical context in the fifth book of the Tusculans, which attempts to show the superiority of the Stoic position as opposed to the old academic one. As Gretchen Radam series has shown in relation to other passages, she doesn't discuss this one from the Tusculans, but she shows that the Stoics did engage, of course, with the Timaeus, appropriating some of its ideas in a way that fitted their own system, and proposing thereby their own version of an argument from assimilation to the divine. Chrysippus's understanding of the Teleios as a life in accordance with human nature as well as that of the universe gives an example of that, where according to Diogenes Laertius, in this context, so in the framework of the discussion of Chrysippus's Teleios, We find also the idea of an agreement, symphonia, of the daimon dwelling in each of us with the will of the administrator of the universe. Right, so against this background, we can approach now the ideas of the next generation of interpreters of Plato in Alexandria and see how they reconstructed the Platonic Telos. The doxography of the Platonic Telos belongs to the first part of chapter 2.7 in Stobaeus' anthology, and derives from the epitome of a certain Didymus from Alexandria, who is widely assumed to have been the court philosopher of Augustus, although this assumption has been questioned. The very long quotes from Didymus's summary comprise a first doxographical part, which is organized around problems, problematikos. And this is where the parts on the Platonic Telos belong. This is where the parts that I'm going to discuss belong. Whereas the other two parts of this doxographical part in Stobaeus is organized around schools. And there we find two long pieces on Stoic and peripatetic ethics. We may assume, as David Ham has suggested, that all of them derive from the same source. The first part, the so-called doxography A, proceeds by offering definitions first of related to the ethical part of philosophy, and then cites two elaborate divisions. The first stemming from Philo of Larissa, and the second one from Eudorus of Alexandria. The association between the two is reinforced by the fact that Eudorus is explicitly called an academic philosopher, a fact that is not very much discussed in the literature on Eudorus. I mean, what exactly this academic character of his philosophy amounts to. Didymus refers to a book which he calls Worth Getting, which contained a classification of all philosophical topics or problems according to the tripartite classification into ethics, physics, and dialectic. And from that, he cites specifically his division of ethics, which comprises three major parts: the theoretical investigation into the values of things. This is text 15 on your handout. The part on impulse, or me, and the part on action, praxis. Following that, he goes on to quote some of those problemata, and specifically he offers a discussion of the topic of the telos, where the formula homoiousis theo is introduced, and this is text 16 on the handout. In the first part of the passage, Pythagoras is mentioned alongside Plato and Socrates as advocating the idea of assimilation to the divine, which features in Plato's Theaetetus, the famous formula in the Theaetetus. The connection with Pythagoras seems to point to the Timaeus, however, so there is a link made there between the Theaetetus formula and the Timaeus, as suggested by the following identification of God with the demiurge, the one who creates and the one who manages the cosmos. So he says that in God, I mean literally, and theo, there is the cosmopoion and cosmodeikitikon, the power that creates the cosmos and the one that manages the cosmos. Perhaps it is of significance here that he says that it is in God. This might raise the question whether he, strictly speaking, identifies, say, the God with the word soul or the demiurge. The sage, it is further said, should become like the demiurgic god who manages the cosmos providentially. In managing his own life through phronesis, one should imitate, that is, the providential sort of activity of the divine. And this seems to place the telos here firmly within a practical dimension. Further in the text, I think that it is suggestive that the Pythagorean telos of following God is accompanied by a qualification explaining that it is not referring to the visible God and the one who precedes. It is a question here how to translate the proekumenos. I take it that it is somehow relates to the visibility of God. It's the first aspect of God that we see. But to the intelligible God who imposes harmony and order on the cosmos. So what Pythagoras refers to, the God he refers to, is actually the intelligible God, and the one who imposes harmony to the universe. In the light of the passages we saw before, this may well be a response to appropriations of the Timaeus on the part of the Stoics. So contrary to this idea which is perhaps reflected in the Tuscan Disputations passage, Eudorus, if he's indeed the originator of these ideas, aims at conveying the proper Platonic and at the same time Pythagorean point of view. And at the same time, he uses at the end of the passage a verbatim quotation from the Timaeus, where Plato explicitly referred to the telos. The word telos comes up there. The second part of the passage underlines the plurality of expressions that Plato used to convey the telos. 3 passages are cited according to the tripartite division of philosophy. So he says that Plato expressed the telos physicos, from the point of view of physics in the Timaeus, ethicos, from the point of view of ethics in the Republic, and logikos, from the point of view of dialectic or logic in the Theaetetus. And he adds to that also the laws as an important text for the idea of following the divine. So in the laws as well, Plato clarified his views about what it means to follow the divine. The doxographer adopts here a hermeneutical principle according to which Plato had a variety of expression, but not a variety of opinions or doctrines. This is conveyed by means of a musical metaphor, according to which polyphony may result in a harmonious whole, in a symphonia. So we have on the one hand the polyphonia in terms of the diversity of expressions, but at the same time we have a symphonia, an agreement or consistency with regard to the meaning or the ideas which are expressed. So the views might have a different linguistic expression, but they are not incompatible with one another. The doxographer also makes use of the Aristotelian principle of the polachos legomenon, which he later uses to refer to diverse meanings of the word agathon in Plato, in order to account for the diversity of the different formulations of the telos. This is clearly not a case of a simple homonymy, but relies on the view that all different formulations of the telos, which are not even homonymous with one another, are dependent upon a core idea, namely that happiness ultimately amounts to living according to virtue. And the corollary of this is also that virtue is sufficient for happiness. Finally, the passage conveys another phrase which may be understood as a differentiation of the Platonic view from the Stoic one. The telos amounts not to a mere possession, ekthesis, of the virtue, of the perfect virtue, but also a use, a chresis of virtue. And this idea of the chresis becomes relevant also later on in this toxographical part, when the toxographer attempts to specify the Platonic notion of the agathon, offering a more nuanced view regarding the relation of virtue with other goods, with the bodily and external goods, and this should be the last passage on your handout. So it is said there, here is another way, only the morally fine is good. Of existing things, none is good unless it partakes of virtue, just as the torch and iron partake in fire, without which absolutely nothing is hot. Among the remainder of the three classes, the following two, those pertaining to the body and external ones, are good insofar as they share in it, namely virtue. For just as the substance of the moon is in itself lacking in light, but is illuminated by sharing in the light of the sun, so nothing which has no share of virtue is good. So it is possible for human things to benefit by virtue of the divine things. This position reflects a line of argument in the Euthydemus, according to which only wisdom is good because it directs our conduct in relation to the right use of other things. But the reference to the theia and anthropina, to the divine and human things, alludes directly to the first book of the Laws, where there is reference to divine goods alongside human ones, including the human ones include health, beauty, bodily strength, and wealth, and where also the dependence of the value of bodily and external goods on the value of virtue is referred to. And in another part of this toxographical piece, Didymus or Eudorus refers extensively to this passage in the Laws, where we have a reference to the divine and the human goods. The passage starts in a way that is very much reminiscent of Stoic ideas, but by granting that other things can be good as well, assuming, of course, that they are used in a virtuous way, it seems to occupy an intermediary position between the Stoic and the Antiochian one we saw before. Okay, I think I have talked a lot, so let me just conclude with some brief remarks. There is some elements here that I think that suggests a continuity between the Antiochian approach and Eudorus's approach towards the reconstruction of Platonic doctrines. Both aim at reconstructing Platonic doctrines through the use of a more inclusive tradition. In the case of Antiochus, it is the Peripatos. In the case of Eudorus, Pythagorean views. They both read and classify the dialogues according to a tripartite division of philosophy. And I think they both aim at offering an answer to the Stoics. They want to differentiate themselves from Stoic views. Aside from the emphasis that Eudorus gives to Plato's Pythagorean character, which is, however, not entirely absent in Antiochus' time as well, as we have seen, a clear difference seems to be found in the way they approach Aristotle. Probably under the influence of the priority given to the categories in the new edition of Andronicus, as Michael Griffin has argued, Eudorus uses Aristotle as a methodological tool to account for the diversity of Platonic formulations, without having to choose an exclusive dialogue for ethics, for example. He can use different dialogues in the corpus. And through the tool of the polachos legomenon, he can somehow make them relevant for the ethical discourse. At the same time, Eudorus treats Aristotle not as a member of the Old Academy, as Antiochus did. Something which becomes clear from the fact that he does not grant an inherent value to bodily goods, as we find in the last book of the Finicus, but makes the value of bodily and external goods wholly dependent on their virtuous use. And this is in line with, as I said already, with passages in the Euthydemus and the Laws. This leads to an attempt to understand the peripatetic tradition in its own terms, and the Platonic one only in terms of its academic and Pythagorean aspects. What emerges is, I think, a very dynamic environment for the interpretation of the Platonic dialogues in relation to previous traditions, which subsequent generations of Platonists are going to develop in different directions. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'm looking forward to questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgia, for this great and rich talk. So now it is time for discussion. Well, if there is no question for the moment, I do have one. It concerns text number 13, where necessity is mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering whether this could be an allusion to Republic 10, the Myth of Fear, and Laws book 7, where necessity occurs once again.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but maybe we can find that in the Timaeus as well.
Yes,
right? I mean, is there a reference to the Pepro? I mean, yeah.
In the Timaeus, it is another kind of necessity. It is the kind of necessity that is persuaded by intellect.
Mm. Yeah.
Oh.
It is not identified, you mean, with intellect. That is that would be the yes. I'm just wondering whether, whether Antiochus could take, because I think there is a wording which is like alluding to the Pepromenon.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly the text, but I'm wondering whether he could then read that in. But you're right. I mean, this doesn't seem to fit very well. I mean, the Laws would be a much better example.
You see, because it is the word immutabilem, immutable. This reminds me of Anangi in the Myth of Fear, which is totally inert, not inert, but yes, immutable. So perhaps the Republic as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes. I think the very same expressions, of course, feature in the Stoic accounts, of the immutability of necessity. So he's very much borrowing, I think, from the Stoics as well. But the real question, of course, is, how does he apply that to Plato, or how does he think that Plato endorses that? And this necessity here is the same. I think it's also problematic that he identifies it with the prudentia, the providentiality of the divine as well. Right. So these seem to be two aspects of the same thing.
And also that he says that it is animum, but also mens.
Do you think there's a difference there between?
I'm wondering. I don't know.
No, this is animum mundi, so it's the mind of.
Yes, animum mundi, the world soul. So this world soul is the same as mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It seems to be identified. It seems that he doesn't differentiate between the world soul and the divine mind. And this, of course, would be an issue that subsequent Platonists will have, big problems with, which raises, of course, the whole question of immanence and transcendence in Antiochus. I mean, it's not. I think it is clear that he offers an alternative to Stoicism. I mean, this animus or mens is not a material mens, but it's still very much connected with the cosmos, right? It's
so if I'm getting it correctly, it is because he starts from a Stoic. He has a Stoic starting point that he identifies the world soul with mens.
Yeah, I think so. I think it is not. Yeah, I think it is somehow he's certainly in dialogue with Stoicism. He wants to offer an alternative position, but maybe this also kind of restrains him in the way he sees things, and to what extent he can separate between the two. Whereas in the Eudorus or Didymus passage, I think these comments that we're talking about the Noeton, right? The god who is, it's again here a question, how do you interpret the idea that the cosmopion and cosmodeiketikon, this somehow management of the cosmos is in the divine in text 16. At the same time, when he talks about Pythagoras, he says that we should understand this god as not the visible one, but the noetos, the intelligible one. And there he seems to be wanting to go a step further from Antiochus, perhaps.
So from a Stoicizing interpretation of Plato, we move towards a more, more Platonic Pythagorizing interpretation.
Yes, or what we think is more Platonic, yes, I guess, yes. in the view of the subsequent
yes, of course.
Tradition. Yeah.
Professor Altman?
Yes, picking up on that passage that the two of you are discussing, I wonder, Georgia, if it might be helpful for you to link Antiochus to Eudorus, to go a little bit further in the academic books, the next section 130, which I don't think you do quote. Because I think if you're going to establish a connection between Eudorus and anybody, you're going to have to deal with the kind of emergence of the one and the Pythagorean elements that came with that reemergence. I mean, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but that seems clear to me. And if you look at 130, I don't know if you have the text with you, but it's where he goes into the so Varro is summarizing Antiochus's logic, and you actually get a good bit of Platonism in here, where the word idea is mentioned, but the way he talks about idea, you'll notice a few lines into 130, where he says that it's not only id quod semper esset simplex et unius modi. So the utter simplicity of the idea and its and of its one mode might be a way that you could link not just the ethical element in Eudorus, but also the, what certainly Dylan thinks is the more important element, which is the arrival of the one. And so I just wondered if that passage might be of any use to you, because it seems to me that I thought that you ended your paper by talking about later developments, because really the best evidence that Eudorus and Antiochus can be synthesized would be, as you say in the very last sentence of your paper, later developments by later people. That the idea that they're actually synthesizable in and of themselves on the basis of what Cicero or preserves, or what Didymus through Stobaeus preserves, I think is tenuous. So I'm hoping that this might help you.
Yes, I mean, I didn't want to establish a connection necessarily between the two. I mean, an explicit connection. I was just, interested in what happens if what are the similarities and the differences of their approaches? Because usually it is mostly the differences that are highlighted, focusing on precisely the way Eudorus introduces metaphysical principles, Now, on the question 130, so the reference to the ideas, this is, of course, as you know, a very vexed question. I mean, what was Antiochus's view about Platonic ideas? In 130, it fits. He discusses them in the framework of epistemology, and this, I think, is quite suggestive, right? He doesn't put references to the ideas to the physical part, or he doesn't attempt to make a connection with the divine mind that we saw before. Although people assume that he held the idea that ideas are the thoughts of God, but this happens mostly on the basis of later evidence, Varus's evidence. But I think from the texts in Cicero, we cannot really conclusively say that, whether he thought that, ideas are, he made a system whereby the ideas are the thoughts of God. However, he does grant a role to the ideas as, I take it, an alternative to an answer to the Stoic idea of innate concepts. And the passage just quoted, I think, because he says these ideas are id quod semper est simplex and unius modi et tale quale. I think this must be a reference to the Sophist, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, this seems to be a quotation from the Sophist there. But still, I think it is kind of he seems to be constrained by this division of philosophy into the three disciplines, and ideas fit into the dialectical part. At the same time, he criticizes Aristotle for destroying Platonic ideas. There is this famous labefactavit. But yeah, how does this relate? How do ideas relate to the divine mind? Is not very clear. Now, what Eudorus? I mean, what does Eudorus think about the connection of the one and the idea of the good? I think this must be again, a complicated question. I think in the ethical doxography that I studied, I mean, he does apply the Polachos legomenon to the analysis of the agathon, and he says that there is the idea of the good, which is choriston. This is the most we get, I think. But in his talk about the divine, the passage we saw, I don't know if one can accommodate, I mean, what is exactly, I mean, is this divine mind at the same time the idea of the good? I'm not sure. I'm a bit afraid to talk about these things, but I'm sure others have thought about them more than me. But it doesn't seem to me so clear. I mean, the connection in Eudorus between certainly he talks about the Pythagorean one in the context of his analysis of Pythagorean views, but how does this exactly relate to the idea of the good?
Other questions or comments or? Well, then I would go for a second one, if you allow your year.
Of course.
I don't remember which passage it is where I think it is passage 17 or no, 16, about Plato's polyphonon or polydoxon. So could we say that this is perhaps the origin of later Neoplatonic symphonia, in the sense that Plato has not many voices, so in a way has many voices, but these voices do not contradict each other. So there is a kind of agreement of symphonia, and in later Neoplatonism, this agreement is enlarged, as it were, to include not only symphonia of Plato symphonia with himself, but Plato and Aristotle. So could this be a key passage for symphonia?
So they use the same word, right? I mean, in Neoplatonism. So you have again the polyphony and the symphony. Do you have both these?
Symphonia. No, you have symphonia.
Right. I mean, the word comes, I mean, you see, he says it amounts to a symphonon to dogmatos. This is the expression that we get here. The variety of expression amounts to a symphonon of dogmatos. So I take it that, yes, I mean, that could be, or at least this is the beginning of such an approach. By the way, I think this, I mean, at least the polyphonon seems to be a term that applied also to literary criticism. I think we find it also in discussion of Homer, for example. Contrary to polydoxon, which seems to me it's a very unique word. I think it's only I have only found it. I have found only one occurrence besides this text, which is Timon's reference to Parmenides. He calls him non-polydoxon. I don't know if that could be related here, or if the writer of the doxography wanted to allude to that. But yeah, I mean, I think, again, I would be interested to know more about, what is the basis of the symphonia in the Neoplatonist texts, I mean, whether they had a more elaborate, I'm sure they had a more elaborate way of establishing that. Because the very interesting thing here, I think, is that you have this metaphor, this musical metaphor, which is also connected to the Aristotelian idea, of the polachos legomenon. You can have but it's a broad application of that, certainly, because you don't have here, strictly speaking, homonymous expressions. You have a variety of expressions, but somehow there is a core idea they relate to. And here it is, in the case of ethics, it is identified with the katareten. I don't know, for example, what, if Neoplatonists would also see that as a point of agreement in the case of ethics, for example.
Thank you. I think that Professor Altman also has a second question, so please.
Well, Irini, I think that the question that you asked, Georgia, is really a fascinating one, and it leads to maybe a question for you both. It's a kind of which comes first, the cart or the horse. In other words, if you're a dogmatic thinker, that you're going to. You didn't mention the Stoics, you mentioned the Neoplatonists appropriating Aristotle as well as Plato, but you could throw in the Pythagoreans and the Stoics as well, so that when you've got a dogmatic philosophizing, then everything becomes grist to its mill, and you can get all of these disparate things that are then churned through into a dogmatic monody as opposed to a polyphony. But it seems to me that it might be interesting to flip that, especially for his base. I mean, I guess so. She's saying that she doesn't really want to synthesize Antiochus and Eudorus. But how about this as an idea, that when a thinker starts with a synthetic approach, in other words, so Antiochus says, everybody's thought that the gap between the Stoics and the Platonists is a lot bigger than I think it is, and I'm going to try to show that there isn't a big gap between them. So I'm going to kind of come up with a view that synthesizes the Stoics and Plato. And then you've got a guy like Eudorus, who what he seems to be doing is adding a very strongly Pythagorean element to Platonism. In other words, that I'm going to add this. I'm going to read Plato in an archly Pythagorean way, and that's going to elevate the one. What I mean by the cart and the horse is that maybe what leads to dogmatism and symphonia is the initial impetus to combine two apparently opposite points of view, like the difference between Pythagoras and Plato, which are pretty clearly distinguished by Aristotle, or the Stoics and the Platonists, which certainly Cicero is aware of a distinction to be made there, and that the habit of mind that begins with combining two different schools of thought ineluctably leads to dogmatism. In other words, that it's not dogmatism that synthesizes apparently disparate schools of thought. It's the initial impetus to synthesize disparate schools of thought that leads to a symphonic dogmatism. This is what I got out of your question, Irini, because I never thought about it in those terms until you asked the question. So I guess I'm asking that to both of you.
Well, yes, I mean, well, the opposite of symphony is, of course, diaphony, and we know that the academy before Antiochus was all about that, right? I mean, it's all about tracing the differences between schools and opposing the one school to the other. And somehow, paradoxically, from this kind of framework, you know, I mean, for the purposes of refutation, you can also make alliances, right? You can say that, oh, you Stoics are not so original as you think you are, because you look at, you know, look already at Aristotle, or even some passages in Plato, you know, he has already said what you think is your distinctive view or an original view. So I think that the ground was already prepared in some sense from that kind of approach. And then comes Antiochus, who actually says, okay, yes, but now I want to actually defend that as a viable possibility, you know, that there is a real, not just the dialectical and polemical approach, but really a kind of agreement on certain key things, which of course is to some extent doomed to fail, because we know, I mean, in his case, the alliance between the academics and the peripatetics, Cicero comes and says, how can you really say that the peripatetics believe that virtue is sufficient for happiness? I mean, if you read the Nicomachean Ethics, you will not be able to sustain that, right? I mean, of course, he refers to Theophrastus a lot, and you know, but yeah, I mean, here I think Eudorus is taking, again, he's trying to establish a broad symphonia, but it's different from the symphonia of Antiochus, because he doesn't want to, I think, make an agreement between Plato and Aristotle. He doesn't think that would work, and he's much more keen to see these two traditions in their own terms. But on the other hand, in the case of Plato, he wants to bring the Pythagorean point of view on the assumption that Plato was Pythagorean. I mean, at least in the Timaeus and in the Philebus, perhaps. But again, what I didn't discuss is, of course, that, you know, in the doxography, he applies the polachos legomenon in defining the agathon, and there you have the feeling that at some point he comes, it's difficult to establish the symphonia, because he talks about, for example, the agathon as the idea of the good. This is one eidos, one species of agathon, and then he says the agathon is the phronesis only, and then he says the agathon is phronesis and pleasure, because he has in mind the Philebus, right? So I was not sure there to what extent the strategy can really work. Yeah? And at some point he even says that, you know, there's some approximation between Democritus and Plato, because they both had views about what is, you know, ataraxia or pleasure on the basis of the Philebus. So he's trying to read that, you know, find the symphonia between the I think three dialogues are very, very important here. And this is the Timaeus, the Philebus, and the Laws. And I think it is not accidental at all that we have the focus on these, given the Pythagorean tendencies. But I think he comes into difficulties, especially with the Philebus, I think, to fit that in. So there are clearly some tensions and some, I think, places where that symphonia seems to even collapse. I'm sorry, I don't know if that was any helpful.
Well, since it was a question to both of us, I can say what I think, although it is not my the period that I specialize on. So I would tend to think that it is the intention to put different views together, or the conviction that different views can be put together, that in a way leads to dogmatism. And perhaps this has something to do with an aria. Georgia perhaps can say more about that. And then my impression was that this symphonia becomes a very Alexandrian thing, in the sense that we find it in Evdoros, and later, much later, but Ammonios Sakas will talk about philosophy without conflict, Astasiastos philosophia. So this idea of harmonizing different philosophical views seems to be very popular in Alexandria, and it was exactly that way of reading philosophy that would dominate late antiquity. So I think it's an Alexandrian thing.
So just to follow up, so you're in sympathy with the idea that of the two phenomena, dogmatism and symphonia of opposed views, that it actually might be the attempt to be symphonic that leads to dogmatism rather than, because I mean, we can see empirically that people that are dogmatic tend to be symphonic. We can see that in the great synthesizer, above all, and I would think in Plotinus, where everything is grist to his mill, from the Chaldean oracles to the Stoics to Posidonius to Plato to Aristotle, et cetera, et cetera. But that well, let me ask you this, Irina. Do you think that there might be, since you're focusing it on Alexandria, do you think that there might be a political dimension to this? I mean, I was struck by Georgia's comment right at the very beginning of her paper, where she dated Antiochus in terms of Sulla and Athens. That, for example, in a democratic city, to have the absence of stasis is to have the absence of democracy. I mean, when there's no clash of contrary views, there's no democracy, because stasis is endemic to Eleutheria. And so I'm wondering if there might be a political dimension that led to imperial Platonism, in the sense of being a dogmatic school that synthesized a wide variety of ostensibly or apparently incompatible views. Because let's face it, if you can synthesize Plato and the Stoics, you can certainly synthesize Plato and Aristotle, it seems to me. That there might be a political dimension in that symphonic drive to find the one thing that unites all, which of course at that time was the Roman Empire.
Well, I hadn't thought of that, and I'm not sure that I can answer now. But what I can think of is that, for example, the agreement between Plato and what was thought of as Pythagorean goes back to Speusippos and Xenocrates, so the very first successors of Plato in the academy. And in that sense, agreement does not seem to be related to, I mean, philosophical symphonia would not be related to the historical context of Hellenistic monarchy and Roman Empire. But I hadn't thought of that dimension, so thank you for.
Well, I mean, just to pick up on that briefly, I mean, said that Speusippus is the head of the academy at the time of the Battle of Chaeronea. So Sylla's conquest of Athens in the 1st century BC is roughly parallel to Philip's defeat of Athens at the time that Speusippus is there. And as I don't know if you've read Speusippus's letter to Philip, but that I think that you could actually link that earlier phenomenon to the same thing. That, in other words, the political hegemony of whether it's Macedon or Rome tends to syncretism on the grounds that democracy is dead.
Well, perhaps in Aristotle metaphysics, the is koiranos has something to do with politics, but I'm not sure. I have to think of this aspect. Thank you for.
Well, thank you for your very interesting question. That was very nice. Thank you.
More questions or remarks or comments? So if there are not, let us thank Georgia once again for her talk and for the discussion, and thank you all for attending. Let me also say that our next lecture will be by Professor Andrew Smith on the 7th of February, and the topic will be Porphyry, Poet, Philosopher, and Priest, ? So thank you, Georgia, again. Thank you all, and have a great holiday